All right, next question.
All right, question 5 from Kiran. Is there any difference between property and capital as used by NLI? I know that property is that which is invested in and defended, and I consider capital as perhaps a subset of property that can be deployed and allocated and consumed, like money, commodities, energy, etc. Excuse me. This would rule out kinship and institutional property as forms of capital. Violence will be considered a form of capital, as violence can be deployed and the capacity for violence must be maintained and invested in. Violence not being in itself property, but the first order consequence of it. Is this correct?
Capital is a property that can be utilized for further production. That doesn't rule out kin and institution at all. In fact, that's why we even have institutions. Violence as a capital doesn't make sense, as violence is something that happens in time, but capacity for violence, which can be employed as needed, does, which is probably what you meant.
Yes. Martin's right, of course. I'll tell you why I went from property to capital is because if you look at the history of economic thought and the history of moral thought on using economics, the term property is heavily biased to the libertarian definition of intersubjective viability, which tends to mean that things are physical. So I viewed that definition of property as part of the Jewish, Austrian, the Jewish and Jewish Austrian wing's attempt to preserve irresponsibility for commons and the attempt to justify theft of parasitism on and externalization of costs into commons. So the Jewish libertarian Rothbardian says this is essentially just fraud. So what I want to do is get away from the term of property since it had been abused. The second thing is for property to exist, the concept of property requires people to acknowledge it, either as an agreement, a norm, or a formal institution of insurance of that of property. So just as the early economists worked with physical material property, Hayek added informal property, norms, traditions, behaviors, institutions, knowledge, everything. And I added informational capital. In other words, that we are all just as dependent upon the quality of information in our societies as we are on its formal and informal institutions, as we are on its demographics, population, and their contingent physical capital and territorial capital. I wanted to be able to talk about these demonstrated interests across a whole spectrum while being free of the legacy of the term property as used by the Marxists and the libertarians, which are really just middle-class Marxists. So I used capital. I went from property and in toto to capital and in toto. And Martin's correct is that capital is anything into which you have demonstrated an interest, and that for how did you say it, Martin? For
Can be used for further production.
Right, can be used for and further production, which could be production could be just time savings, right? I mean, it doesn't matter. So that's why we went to talking about capital in toto, is to leave behind the legacy of the abuse of the term property and to more generalize it so that we could address classical Hayekian and Doolittle spectrums of demonstrated interests. You'll see us use the term demonstrated interests a lot, and use capital when we're talking about general, impositions of costs upon it, etc. But those two things, there are very few demonstrated interests that are not capital. I can't think of any, and very little capital that's not a demonstrated interest. If there are exceptions to the rule, I certainly can't think of any.
Our capital is demonstrated interest unless you're giving it up, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Waste, but not our capital, not our demonstrated interests are capital. Some are just for consumption.
Consumption, correct, yes. Oh, we killed that one. I've said that libertarians are just middle-class Marxists a lot. I surprised. Maybe
the first time I heard it.
Really? It's like you have so if you think of Marxism as the feminine tendency to want everything to be the same, so that rents can be extracted, you have the lower class Marxists, right? Which is the traditional term. You have the libertarians as middle class Marxists. You have the neocons as upper class Marxists, and you have the anti-Western, anti-male feminists as feminine Marxists. But I mean, it's all the same shit. It's the same thing with postmodernism. It's the same thing. It's just the attempt to delegitimize systems of measurement so thefts can be made. It's all fucking scams. It's just amazing to me. Go ahead, Martin.
Just clarify that what you mean is on whose behalf they pretend to speak. But obviously, all Marxists have been middle class or upper class.
Yes, thank you. Yes, well, which power structure?
That is so right. Because I think only the middle class or upper class can't afford to be Marxist, just like
That's right.
the current set of Marxists that are trying to instill their rules on everybody.
It's not like it was lower classes arguing for themselves. It never happens. All movements are led by elite.
So what you're saying is that, as I'm phrasing this incorrectly, what you mean is that that what class are the intellectual Marxists trying to weaponize against the West?
Yes. So sometimes on whose behalf they pretend to speak, even though that class may not actually agree with them.
Correct.
This is Michael McConkie inspired a lot of my thought. His name right calls this class ventriloquism. And you pretend to be the voice of another class when you're actually speaking for the interest of your own class.
Yeah. And sometimes they don't even tell actually, all of these liars have to tell lies to themselves to convince that what they're doing is justified.
Yeah.